Welcome back. KXEL Live and Local continues. Brand new year 2024. That means the month of January, and that means a brand new issue of Iowa History Journal, the magazine that comes out 6 times each year. Thanks to owner and publisher Michael Swanger, who joins us via Zoom from his home base in the Des Moines metro area. Happy New Year, sir.
Happy New Year, Jeff. Always a pleasure. Great way to start the year.
Well, you have touched on in this new issue, which is the first issue of volume 16. That alone is hard to believe. You've started off with a cover story that you actually had the opportunity to write. That's one of the problems when you run the business. You often can't do what you really like, which is writing and telling stories. This is one we've told at times on the Iowa Almanac, but it's just a fascinating story that, frankly, I don't think enough people know about. So let's talk about the cover story that you authored for the new issue of Iowa History Journal.
Sounds good, Jeff. Well, as you know, we are approaching the 90th anniversary of arguably the most famous bank robbery in Iowa history that was committed by none other than the infamous John Dillinger. John Dillinger and his gang robbed the First National Bank in Mason City on March 13th, 1934. And they got away with $52,000, which at the time was one of their bigger heists. That translates to about $1 million today. They would have taken more money. They had intended to steal about $250,000, but that didn't work out. But nonetheless, it was a huge crime committed that has lived on in the annals of popular history, not only in our state but across our nation, which, as you know and listeners know, ties in with the public's fascination with outlaw gangsters and other anti-heroes. And John Dillinger certainly is steeped in the annals of our histories, our history, because of what he did just on that one day alone.
And it was not a matter like you would see sometimes in the movies and like happened at other places where the car pulls up, guys with guns get out of it, they take the money and off they go. This actually involved hostage taking.
You're right. It was very interesting in that regard. And just to kind of recap what happened that day based on the research that I conducted, reading various newspaper accounts, going through the FBI online archives, which anyone can search for themselves, which that alone is a wonderful rabbit hole to go down if you have a couple of days. It was interesting from that perspective. It did start like many robberies. Dillinger's gang, there were 6 members and a driver. There's a lot of argument today still about who the driver was. There was a couple of men that people think could have been the driver, but nonetheless, we know the 6 robbers: John Dillinger, Tommy Carroll, Eddie Green, John Hamilton, Homer Van Meter, and a guy named Babyface Nelson, who became quite notorious himself. Those guys had advanced scouted the bank. A couple of the robbers had stayed at the local YMCA for about a week. They knew what they were doing. They had every angle covered. And I think that they knew that they were going to take hostages. So when they showed up about 2:40 p.m. that afternoon, it was just a normal Tuesday in Mason City. And two of the robbers entered the bank. Dillinger was one of the guys posted outside of the bank. And everything went according to plan in terms of they had scoped out the bank. They knew where the vault was and everything. And they got the money and they got out. Now, I don't know if they had planned to take hostages or not. And there are various reports about how many they took. In my story, I said approximately 11. The Mason City Globe Gazette reported the following day that there were 11 people that they had taken hostage. But what makes it interesting, Jeff, as you know, is that it wasn't like they had a big vehicle to put all these hostages in. They were driving a 1933 Buick 90, which at the time was a luxury car, and had those cars back in that time had running boards. And they forced the hostages at gunpoint to stand on the running boards. A couple of the hostages were also squeezed inside. 2 women were forced to sit on the laps of some of the gangsters sitting in there just to squeeze everyone in. But they had 11 hostages approximately, most of them staying on the running board. They're trying to escape town. They can't go fast. It's not a very fast car to begin with. And they have all that weight. So they're driving slowly through Mason City downtown. during their escape. They were successful nonetheless. They headed southeast out of town and gradually started dropping them off. They were kind about it. They would slow down and let them off, and the last two were let out about 3.5 miles out of town before they made their escape across the Iowa-Minnesota border to St. Paul. So it was unusual at that time because uh, it was like you said, it was a typical robbery in essence in terms of showing up quickly, getting the job done, but you don't read about a lot of bank robberies at that time that involved hostages.
Michael Swanger is the owner and publisher of Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. He is also the author of the cover story on the day the Dillinger gang robbed the First National Bank in Mason City, and we're upcoming to the 90th anniversary of that. This was one of the last big jobs that the gang would pull off.
You're right. Basically, Dillinger's reign of terror lasted only a year. June 1933 to June 1934. This is during the depths of the Great Depression. This is near the end, the peak of what is deemed the gangster era. And they robbed about a dozen banks across the Midwest. And what really made them such, I don't know, kind of popular in that regard was a portion of Americans at that time blamed the banks for what had happened during the Great Depression. So Dillinger was seen as kind of a hero like Jesse James to some aspects of the public. But obviously, he drew the ire of federal and state officials who were trying to pursue him. He would get captured, and he had a knack for escaping all the time. And once he escaped from a prison in Indiana and stole a car and drove it across state lines to Illinois, he violated a federal National Motor Act. And that's what got the feds involved. And really, it was Dillinger who was the impetus for the creation of the FBI, because Edgar Hoover was newly appointed to a federal bureau of investigation, but it wasn't known as that. And because Hoover was so obsessed with catching Dillinger, he convinced the powers that be to create the FBI and to make it more sophisticated so that they could catch him. A few months after they robbed Mason City is when Hoover and the G-men deemed Dillinger to be public enemy number one. And we have a picture of two posters, wanted posters. One, I always thought it'd be great to publish a wanted poster on the cover of IHA. So I was happy. That's a legitimate poster, wanted poster of Dillinger on the cover. And then we have another one on the inside where it is asking for, it offers rewards of $10,000 for his capture or $5,000 for information leading to it. And you're right. It was just in June, a few months after robbing Mason City, that those posters were across the country. And then a month later, Dillinger met his fate in Chicago, where he was gunned down after leaving a movie theater, after attending a movie about a gangster. What a coincidence.
Well, we call that research, perhaps. But one of the things you mentioned that is interesting, because of legend and lore, we tend to think that the Dillinger gang's run was of some duration, years. And when you say it was 1 year, I think that's going to surprise a lot of people.
It surprised me once I started looking into it as well. I can't believe how much they condensed into that 1 year. And like I said, they were across the Midwest, and he got caught a couple times. They were also south in Arizona. They would hole up in Chicago. They were in St. Paul. They obviously had places they could hide out. So, and also members of the gang would fluctuate. There were guys he had in Chicago. There were guys he had in St. Paul. And so it kind of depended on where the crime was being committed, who was involved. So it's very interesting to know who the members were. We know that for certain, who committed the crime in Mason City. What's more, there was a photographer, his name is H.C. Kunkelman, who just happened to be filming the bank and captured footage of the gang making their getaway. And we have a still from that film in the story. And you can see Dillinger in his overcoat and dark hat right inside the pages of Iowa History Journal as he's leaving the bank in Mason City.
I have always found it interesting that for a gang that had meticulously scouted out the location, when they pulled up, nobody noticed that a guy with a camera and who had attracted a crowd, that's where they got the hostages, Did they
Right.
not notice there was a person with a camera? It's not like today where you just hold up a cell phone and you're taking video. I guess they were focused on what they were doing, but heavens, gentlemen, look across the street.
You're right, and the crowd that gathered because of the filmmaker obviously complicated matters because I think that they might have gotten away unscathed had it not been for that. Just to kind of flesh out a few of the details
Hmm.
that day, two members of the gang, including Dillinger, were wounded. There were no fatalities that day, and then there were two bystanders that were wounded as well. And coincidentally, it was a judge who had an office on the third floor of the bank who heard the commotion below, saw the crowd gather because of the filmmaker, looked out the window, saw Dillinger. Dillinger took a shot at him, missed him. The judge was irritated, went into his desk, pulled out a pistol, returned to the window, and shot Dillinger and wounded him. So it's hard to say how it would have played out had the filmmaker not been there.
So not only did they not see the photographer, they picked a building with a judge in it who apparently had a vindictive streak. Oh my goodness, I had not heard that fact. That's an interesting morsel to the story, to add to the story. Cover story in the current issue of Iowa History Journal, January, February 2024. If you subscribe, you have had it for a little bit of time. It's now available at all manner of retail locations. And again, it's iowahistoryjournal.com. The wanted poster of John Dillinger on the cover. Michael Swanger, the author of the article and owner-publisher of the magazine, joins us on News Talk 1540 KXEL. You have also in recent issues brought in some new contributors who have real connections to the story. And I'm thinking of in the last issue, the former Hawkeye athletic standout Quinn Early wrote about someone who blazed the trail for him as a person of color a century before. Now you've got a relation story, and again, it has to do with the Hawkeyes.
You're right, Jeff. It's nice to have those connections. And fortunately, we're at the point now, as we begin our 16th year, that more and more people are becoming aware of the magazine. So I'm continuing to get story ideas from far reaches that I would never have anticipated, including our story about Doyle Alsop, known as Doc Alsop, who was Iowa's first athletic trainer at the University of Iowa. His grandson, Mark Peterson, lives in California. He reached out to me almost a year ago and said, "Are you familiar with Doc?" And I said, "No, I'm not." He said, "Well, I've been doing a lot of work, genealogy work on our family, but I'm fascinated by what my grandfather did. He had vague memories of him." And so over the course of time, he was just collecting a lot of material from his family archives and put it together for us. He said, he's not a professional writer. He's never contributed this piece or information to anyone else, but he did a wonderful job of writing it. And I think fans who are especially love Hawkeye football, but even if you're just interested in, who knows what's in your family tree, might appreciate this story because I haven't seen it anywhere. I haven't seen it told. I mean, it's one of those names. I'm sure if you went through the archives of the University of Iowa's athletic department, you'd find his name, but there's not much out there about him.
And who better to tell the story than a family member who is able to put the full color to the story?
That's right. And I think Hawkeye fans will be especially interested in the fact that Doyle started working for the Hawks. Well, he worked for the Hawks from 1939 to 1960. He's best known for having worked with the football teams. And it's interesting to me to think that here's a guy who worked with the Ironmen of 1939 and none other than Niall Kinnick, Iowa's Heisman Trophy winner. And so he worked with Niall and all the members of that team. As you know, those guys played both sides of the line. And there were a lot of injuries back then for those guys. There wasn't a lot of equipment. I imagine that Doc went through miles and miles of tape to keep those guys on the field.
At the very least. IowaHistoryJournal.com is where you can learn more and click on the growing list of locations where you can purchase it. Even better, though, and it's an even better financial deal if you subscribe, and you can get an even better deal by subscribing for 2 years instead of one. IowaHistoryJournal.com. Jerry Harrington is a well-known communications professional who has in retirement focused on some book projects, the most recent having to do with former Iowa Governor and U.S. Senator Harold Hughes, and you were able to get him to pull a few Hughes stories that I think folks really probably did not appreciate that were tied to the very volatile 1960s.
Right. This is obviously a sensitive subject, but it's nonetheless, it's a part of our history. It's a story that needs to be told. And Jerry did a nice job of telling it from Hugh's perspective. As you know, he's just released a new book about the governor that's available now. And who better to write it than someone who spent years researching Hughes? And so Jerry knew the story very well. And we talked about it. And I said, I want to, if we're going to approach the subject, I want to see from Hughes' perspective, not only what his intentions were, but how it played out. And to summarize the story, Governor Hughes launched a statewide crusade against racism during the late 60s. He held a series of crisis conferences, and they were a result of the civil rights riots that were taking place not only across the nation, but that were happening in bigger towns in Iowa, in particular Waterloo and Des Moines. We have a photo from the Des Moines Register of protesters in Waterloo in 1966. And then we have another photo of another incident that was well known 2 years later in 1968. And in short, when these riots took place, Hughes was like every other elected official in the sense that he condemned the violence, obviously the destruction, as we all do, and but he wanted to know more about it. He wanted to know what the root of the problem was. So instead of just condemning what had taken place, he wanted to get to the bottom of it. And what he did is he started meeting with Black community members in Des Moines and Waterloo, and at some point he reached out to business leaders and religious leaders in 20 of the largest cities in our state to launch a series of conferences, which were really just listening sessions to try to get to the bottom of it. What came about these conferences, the result was that he got these groups raised more than $350,000 to create temporary summer jobs for young people from low-income families in those communities, and about 1,000 families benefited from it. That program only lasted a couple of years, however, and then it just kind of dissipated when he went to successfully run for re-election as a senator in 1969. He never even brought it up that he'd done all this work as governor. But for a couple of years, it was Hughes' attempt to try to get to what he thought was the root of the problem. So it was an interesting story, an interesting part of our history, and I appreciate the way Jerry wrote it.
Fascinating stuff, as always, in Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. And I always appreciate Arvid Huesman's column as he talks about things that happened in past times. But I really, and maybe it's my advancing age, but I really enjoyed his musings this time on the simple things in life and how the things that we treasured when we were young, we come to appreciate again at the other end of the life cycle, perhaps when we are smart enough to pay attention.
Yeah, I think it's beyond waxing nostalgia, as you know, Jeff. As we get older, hopefully we get wiser, and you start paying attention to those things, and you realize that the little things that you took for granted earlier in life were really big things. And he does a great job of writing about some of those things that are meaningful to him. It could be anything from falling asleep to the sound of rain to a child's laughter. And he does a wonderful job of bringing that to our attention and reminding us to be in the moment and pay attention to those things.
All that and more in the new issue of Iowa History Journal, on newsstands everywhere and available online, iowahistoryjournal.com. You were kind enough to allow me the opportunity to tell a story we did on Iowa Almanac about the town of Cooper, Iowa, and its centennial back in 1981, and when they adopted a famous Iowa native as a citizen of the town. And I'm going to leave it there because that's what we call a tease.
Well, really, I should have set this up for you. You're the expert here, Jeff. So thank you for writing it. Johnny Carson,
Yeah.
an honorary 51st resident of the small town of Cooper in Greene County. And we have guys like Terry Rich to thank for that. And and some of the folks who grew up there and decided, well, if we're going to celebrate the centennial of this town and we only have 50 people, we need to find someone famous to become number 51. And as you know, they launched a wonderful contest nationwide and received offers from a lot of famous people, from Fran Tarkenton and Johnny Orr and Mickey Mouse. But Johnny sealed the deal when he decided to have Terry and a few other folks from Cooper on his show. How could he not win that contest? And he's an Iowa native. I don't care what Nebraskans say; they don't understand Johnny's from Iowa.
Yeah, he would never have gotten to where he got had it not been for Iowa. Let's just leave it at that. Yeah, but I actually remember, because this when it happened, I was in between high school and college, and I always watched The Tonight Show from the time I was quite small, and I remember when they had Iowans on, and I remember they were on for 2 segments, and Johnny was auditioning to win the contest. And as Terry Rich has related the story over time, and we share that in this article, what a fantastic experience for all of them. All that and more in the pages of Iowa History Journal, iowahistoryjournal.com. A few of the large retailers where people can pick it up would include
Hy-Vee and Barnes & Noble and Walmart. Not every Walmart. We also are sold at a select Mills Fleet Farm, Arctic Drug, and as well as Hy-Vee drugstores.
Subscribe at iowahistoryjournal.com. Pick up a few extra copies at the newsstand, and a list of the retail locations is at the website. Excellent edition once again, sir. Thank you much. We'll talk when the March-April edition comes out, if not before.
Looking forward to it, Jeff. Thanks again.
Michael Swanger, Iowa History Journal, January-February issue is now out with John Dillinger's wanted poster on the cover. And Mr. Swanger kind enough to join us via Zoom on News Talk 1540 KXEL, where Iowa comes to talk.